The microphone trembled in my hand as 400 wedding guests stared at me. Only 20 minutes earlier, I had been sitting proudly in the front row, watching my daughter walk down the aisle. Now I stood beside the wedding cake while her new father-in-law smiled at me like I was something dirty he had found on the bottom of his shoe. My son married into a family with very little, Gregory Whitmore said into the microphone. But I suppose everyone deserves a chance to sit at the rich people's table. A few guests laughed. My daughter, Claire, froze beside her husband. Then I looked directly at Gregory and said, "Do you even remember who I am?" His smile disappeared. Because he did remember. And 22 years earlier, he had done something that could destroy everything he had spent his life building. My name is Hannah Reed. For most of my life, people knew me simply as Claire's mother. They didn't know that I had once dreamed of becoming a bookkeeper. They didn't know that I had spent years working 2 jobs so my daughter could have the childhood I never had. And they certainly didn't know why Claire's father disappeared before she was born. I raised Claire in a tiny house outside Santa Barbara, California. The house wasn't beautiful. The kitchen window stuck whenever the Santa Ana winds blew, and the old porch creaked so loudly that I could hear Claire coming home before she opened the door. But it was ours. When she was 6, she used to run into my bedroom every Saturday morning and ask, "Mom, are we rich?" I would pull her under the blankets and laugh. "Not in money, sweetheart. But we have pancakes." Sometimes there wasn't enough food for anything fancy. So I made tiny pancakes and told her they were California moons. She believed me. I worked mornings at a nursing home and cleaned offices in downtown Santa Barbara at night. There were evenings when I came home so exhausted that I could barely remove my shoes. But Claire would sit beside me at the kitchen table and tell me about school. She always said the same thing. "One day, Mom, I'll give you the life you deserve." And she grew into exactly the kind of woman I hoped she would become. Kind, smart, gentle. Then she met Ethan Whitmore. They met while volunteering at a children's hospital in Los Angeles. Ethan was different from his family. He listened. He helped around my house. He never once looked embarrassed by where Claire had grown up. I liked him immediately. But I knew his father was trouble. The first time I saw Gregory Whitmore after more than 20 years, I nearly dropped my glass. It was at a dinner in Malibu celebrating Ethan's parents. Gregory looked older, richer, and more powerful. But I recognized those eyes. He recognized me too. For 1 second, fear flashed across his face. Then it disappeared. "Hannah Reed," he said smoothly. "What a surprise." I smiled. "It's been a long time." He leaned closer. "Some things are better left in the past." I knew exactly what he meant. 22 years ago, before Claire was born, Gregory and I worked for the same medical supply company. I handled invoices. He handled money. And one afternoon, I discovered something I was never supposed to see. Money was being transferred from the company into an account connected to Gregory. I made copies of the documents. I told my husband, Daniel. We decided we were going to expose him. But the next morning, everything changed. Gregory accused us of stealing. He had documents with my signature. Documents I had never signed. He had made it look like I was the criminal. And I was pregnant. Terrified. Broke. Gregory looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You can fight me, Hannah. Or you can protect your unborn child." I chose my child. But Daniel didn't. He promised me he would find proof and come back. He left California that night. He never came home. At least, that was what I believed for 22 years. Until my daughter's wedding day. Because standing in that ballroom, after Gregory humiliated me in front of 400 people, a man suddenly appeared at the entrance. He was holding a worn brown folder. And behind him stood 2 police officers. Gregory's face went completely white. The man walked toward us. Then he looked at Gregory and said, "We found the original documents." And suddenly, I realized my daughter's wedding wasn't the end of my family story. It was the beginning of the truth. The man holding the folder was in his late 50s. Gray hair. Tired eyes. A dark suit that looked completely out of place among the flowers, champagne glasses, and expensive decorations. He stopped a few feet from me. Mrs. Reed. I nodded slowly. My name is David Mercer. I used to work for Pacific Horizon Medical. My heart began pounding. Gregory stepped forward. This is neither the time nor the place. David ignored him. I think it is exactly the right place. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of old invoices, bank transfers, employee records, and handwritten notes. I recognized some of the documents immediately. Others I had never seen before. My hands began to shake. Where did you get these? David looked at Gregory. They were hidden in a storage unit in Ventura. Gregory's voice became sharp. You have no right to bring private company records into my son's wedding. David finally turned toward him. They aren't your company records anymore. The ballroom went silent. Claire stepped closer. Mom, what's happening? I wanted to answer her, but I couldn't, because David had pulled out one final document. A letter. The handwriting on the envelope made my entire body go cold. I knew that handwriting. I had seen it every day for years. Daniel. My husband. The man everyone believed had abandoned us. The man Claire had spent her entire life believing didn't love her enough to stay. My daughter stared at the envelope. Mom? I couldn't breathe. David handed it to me. It was found with the original records. I looked at Gregory. For the first time that evening, he wasn't angry. He was afraid. Open it, Claire whispered. I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. The first line made my knees weak. Hannah, if you're reading this, then Gregory finally failed to destroy the truth. I covered my mouth. Claire began crying. Ethan looked at his father. Dad. Gregory shook his head. Don't listen to him. This is a lie. But David interrupted. Your father knows it's not. Gregory suddenly turned toward him. You should have stayed out of this. David smiled sadly. I stayed out of it for 22 years. Then he looked at me. And I regret every single one of them. I kept reading. Daniel's letter explained that he had never left us willingly. He had discovered that Gregory was stealing money from a medical charity connected to the company. Money intended to help children whose families couldn't afford medical equipment. Daniel had copied the evidence. He planned to take it to the police. But before he could, someone attacked him. The letter stopped there. There was no explanation of what happened next. No goodbye. No final message. Just one sentence written beneath the fold. If I disappear, don't believe I abandoned you. My vision blurred with tears. For 22 years, I had carried the shame of being left. I had told Claire that sometimes people were simply not strong enough to stay. I had blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't beautiful enough. Maybe I wasn't successful enough. Maybe Daniel had simply fallen out of love with me. And now I knew. He hadn't left. Someone had taken him away. Claire reached for my hand. Mom, where is Dad? I looked at David. He hesitated. Then he said something that made the entire room disappear around me. We believe we found him. I couldn't speak. Gregory stepped backward. No. David nodded toward the police officers standing near the entrance. One of them has been investigating an unidentified patient in a care facility outside San Luis Obispo. My heart stopped. An unidentified patient? David nodded. A man who was brought in 22 years ago after suffering a severe head injury. Claire whispered. What was his name? David looked at me. The records listed him as Daniel Reed. Gregory suddenly shouted. That's impossible. Everyone turned toward him. And in that moment, I knew. He hadn't just known where Daniel was. He had known all along. For several seconds, nobody moved. The music had stopped. The waiters stood frozen beside tables covered in half-finished dinners. 400 guests were watching Gregory Whitmore unravel in real time. Ethan stared at his father. Dad, he said quietly, what is she talking about? Gregory's face hardened. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But David stepped forward. Then explain the records. Gregory laughed nervously. Old documents? From a company that no longer exists. Not just documents, David replied. We also found financial records, hospital payments, and the name of the employee who changed Daniel Reed's identity. Claire clutched my arm. I could feel her trembling. You mean Grandpa? She stopped herself. She had almost called Gregory Grandpa. The man who had just walked her down the aisle. The man who had toasted her marriage. The man whose family she had just joined. Ethan looked sick. Dad, tell me this isn't true. Gregory turned to his son. Ethan, listen to me. These people are trying to ruin your wedding. No, I said. My voice was shaking, but it was stronger than before. You ruined it yourself. Everyone looked at me. For 22 years, I had avoided speaking Gregory's name. I had buried the memories because remembering hurt too much. But suddenly, I was tired of being afraid. You threatened me when I was pregnant, I said. You framed me and Daniel for stealing. And when Daniel tried to expose you, he disappeared. Gregory pointed at me. You have no proof. David lifted another document from the folder. Actually, we do. He placed it on the table. It was an old hospital admission form. My eyes moved across the page. Date, June 14, 2004. Patient, unidentified male. Condition, severe head trauma. Memory impairment. Then, lower on the page, there was a note. Identity later confirmed as Daniel Reed. My knees almost gave out. Claire grabbed me. Mom. But there was another note. A handwritten instruction added 2 days later. Patient name changed per authorization. The new name was printed beneath it. Michael Stone. I stared at the words. David continued. Daniel was transferred to a private long-term care facility 3 weeks later. His treatment was paid through several accounts connected to Gregory's companies. Ethan slowly turned toward his father. You paid for him? Gregory said nothing. Why? Ethan asked again. Why would you pay for a stranger? His father finally answered. Because I didn't want him dead. The room gasped. Gregory realized what he had said too late. Claire began to cry. I felt strangely calm. For the first time, Gregory had admitted something. Not everything, but enough. David looked at the police officers. One of the men involved in the attack is alive. He agreed to speak. Gregory's eyes widened. No. The officer stepped forward. We have a signed statement. Gregory backed away from the table. And then he looked at the ballroom doors. For 1 second, I thought he was going to run. But he stopped. Because a woman had entered the room. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and a cane. Gregory saw her. And all the color disappeared from his face. David whispered. There's someone else you need to hear from. The woman looked directly at me. Then she said the words I had waited 22 years to hear. Hannah. Her voice broke. I know where your husband is. And suddenly, I couldn't feel the floor beneath my feet. The woman slowly walked toward me. Every step seemed to echo through the ballroom. I recognized her face, though I hadn't seen her in more than 20 years. Her name was Evelyn Hart. She had been the office administrator at Pacific Horizon Medical when Daniel and I worked there. She had been there the day everything changed. Evelyn, I whispered. She nodded. I should have come to you years ago. Gregory's voice suddenly became desperate. Evelyn, don't. She looked at him. You told me Daniel was dead. Gregory said nothing. You told me the accident killed him. Still nothing. And then you told me that if I ever spoke about what happened, my daughter would lose everything. I stared at her. You had a daughter? Evelyn nodded. She was 21 at the time. She had just started college. Her eyes filled with tears. I was afraid of Gregory. We all were. She opened her purse and pulled out a small envelope. I kept this because I couldn't destroy it. She handed it to me. Inside was a photograph. It showed Daniel standing outside the hospital. He was thinner. His face was bruised. But it was him. My husband. Alive. I pressed the photograph against my chest. Where is he? Evelyn looked at David. He's at a care facility near Pismo Beach. My heart shattered. Pismo Beach. Only 2 hours from the little house where I had raised Claire. He had been so close. All these years, I had believed he was somewhere beneath the ground. And he had been alive in California. Claire covered her mouth. I have a father? I turned toward her. Yes. The word came out as a whisper. You have a father. She began sobbing. Ethan stood behind her, tears running down his face. Then he looked at Gregory. How could you do this? Gregory's expression changed. The powerful businessman disappeared. For the first time, he looked like an old, frightened man. I was protecting my family. No, Ethan said. You were protecting yourself. Gregory looked at his son. You don't understand what would have happened if Daniel had gone to the police. I don't care. Ethan's voice cracked. You stole 22 years from that woman. He pointed at me. You stole my wife's father from her. Then he took off his wedding ring. Claire stared at him. Ethan. He shook his head. I need to know the truth. He turned to his father. And if the truth means losing you, then so be it. Gregory looked toward the police. Can we talk somewhere private? The officer shook his head. Not anymore. He placed handcuffs around Gregory's wrists. The ballroom erupted in whispers. Gregory looked at me one last time. You have no idea what Daniel would have become if I hadn't intervened. I stepped closer. You didn't intervene. I looked into his eyes. You erased him. He lowered his head. And then they took him away. But I didn't stay to watch. David had already arranged a car. Claire sat beside me. For the entire drive north, neither of us spoke. The California coastline passed outside the window. Ocean. Cliffs. Golden hills. Everything looked painfully beautiful. Finally, Claire reached for my hand. Mom? Yes. Do you think he'll remember us? I looked at the photograph of Daniel in my lap. I don't know. She squeezed my hand. But we're going to find out. When we arrived at the care facility, a nurse met us at the entrance. She looked at the photograph. Then at me. Her eyes softened. I think he's been waiting for you. My heart stopped. She led us down a quiet hallway. At the end was a small room overlooking the Pacific. A man sat beside the window. His hair was completely gray. His shoulders were thinner. But when he slowly turned toward the door, I knew him. Even after 22 years. I knew my husband. And then his eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood in the doorway, afraid that if I took another step, the man sitting by the window would disappear. Daniel looked at me. His eyes were older than I remembered. But they were still his eyes. Daniel, I whispered. His lips parted. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said my name. Hannah. My knees nearly collapsed. Claire cried behind me. Dad? Daniel looked toward her. His expression changed. Confusion. Fear. Then something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. Claire. She covered her mouth with both hands. I stepped closer. You remember her? Daniel slowly shook his head. Not everything. He looked at Claire again. But I remember a little girl. Claire burst into tears. I was your little girl. Daniel reached for her hand. She ran to him. They held each other for what felt like forever. I stood beside them, crying silently. This was the moment I had imagined thousands of times. But I had never imagined it would happen 22 years later. The nurse quietly left the room. David stayed outside. For the next hour, Daniel told us what he could remember. He remembered leaving California that night. He remembered driving north. He remembered headlights behind him. Then a sudden impact. After that, everything became broken pieces. A hospital room. Pain. People telling him his name was Michael Stone. A man visiting him. Gregory. Daniel remembered asking about his wife. About his unborn child. Gregory told him there was no wife. No child. No family. Daniel didn't believe him. But his memory was damaged. Every time he tried to remember, he became confused. Eventually, he stopped asking questions. Then, years later, pieces began returning. A kitchen. A woman laughing. A little girl with curly brown hair. A tiny house. And pancakes shaped like moons. I laughed through my tears. You remember that? Daniel smiled. California moons. Claire looked at me. You actually made those? Every Saturday. Daniel closed his eyes. I knew there was someone. His voice trembled. I just couldn't reach her. I sat beside him. I waited for you. He took my hand. I know. Outside the window, the Pacific stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time in 22 years, I wasn't waiting anymore. But there was still one thing I needed to understand. Daniel, I asked quietly, why didn't you ever come home? He looked toward David. David stepped into the room. We found the rest of the records this morning. He handed Daniel a copy. Daniel looked at it. Then his face changed. What is this? David pointed to a payment record. Gregory didn't just pay for your care. He paused. He paid someone to make sure you were never released. Daniel stared at the document. I felt cold all over again. Gregory hadn't simply hidden Daniel. He had controlled his entire life. And suddenly, I understood something. The wedding wasn't just the place where Gregory's secret was exposed. It was the place where his entire story finally collapsed. But we still didn't know how much damage he had caused. Until David opened the final file. Inside was a list of names. At the top was Gregory Whitmore. Below it were dozens of others. Employees, bankers, doctors, and one name I recognized immediately. Someone who had been sitting at my daughter's wedding. Someone who had been smiling at me all night. David looked at me. This isn't over, Hannah. He turned the page toward me. There's another person involved. And when I saw the name, my heart stopped. The name on the list was Linda Whitmore, Gregory's wife, Ethan's mother, Claire's future mother-in-law. I looked at David. Linda? He nodded. She knew more than she ever admitted. I couldn't believe it. Linda had been sitting at the wedding all evening. She had watched Gregory humiliate me. She had watched me cry. And she had said nothing. David lowered his voice. She may have been afraid of him. But fear doesn't erase what she knows. We returned to the ballroom. Linda was standing near the windows, staring at the ocean. When she saw me, she immediately began to cry. Hannah. I stopped a few feet away. Did you know? She closed her eyes. Yes, Claire gasped. You knew. Linda looked at her son. I knew something had happened to Daniel. Ethan stepped forward. What exactly did you know? Linda's hands trembled. Your father told me Daniel was dangerous. He said Daniel had stolen money and disappeared before the police could arrest him. I shook my head. That isn't true. I know that now. Linda reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I started recording Gregory years ago. Ethan stared at her. Why? Because I was afraid he would eventually blame me for something. She pressed play. Gregory's voice filled the room. At first, the recording was difficult to understand. Then his words became clear. I told them to keep Reed away from California. If he ever remembers everything, we're finished. My heart stopped. Claire covered her mouth. The recording continued. And Hannah? She'll never speak. She has too much to lose. Then Gregory said something that made Ethan turn pale. 20 years of silence is worth more than any amount of money. The recording ended. Nobody spoke. Linda wiped her tears. I should have come forward years ago. I looked at her. Why didn't you? She lowered her head. Because I was scared. I understood fear. More than anyone in that room. But I also knew what fear could cost. 22 years. A childhood without a father. A marriage stolen. A lifetime of questions. I walked toward Linda. You could have saved us. I know. Her voice broke. I will live with that for the rest of my life. The police took the phone. Gregory was escorted away. This time, he didn't look powerful. He looked defeated. But before leaving, he turned toward Ethan. Son. Ethan stepped back. Don't call me that. Gregory stopped. Ethan looked at him with tears in his eyes. My wife spent her whole life believing her father didn't want her. He pointed toward me. And her mother spent 22 years believing she wasn't worth staying for. His voice cracked. You didn't just destroy Daniel. He looked at Claire. You destroyed all of us. Gregory was taken through the ballroom doors. The room slowly began emptying. The wedding was over. The flowers were still beautiful. The cake was still untouched. But nobody cared anymore. Claire walked over to me and hugged me. I don't want this wedding to be the thing I remember. I held her tightly. It won't be. She pulled away. What will you remember? I looked toward the doors where Gregory had disappeared. Your father coming home. For the first time that night, Claire smiled. And somewhere outside, the California sun was setting over the Pacific. The truth had finally found us. But there was still one thing I didn't know. What would happen to Daniel now? He had lost 22 years. And I had no idea whether we could ever learn how to become a family again. The weeks after the wedding were nothing like I had imagined. There were police interviews, lawyers, old financial records, people I had never heard of suddenly calling me and telling me what Gregory had done. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet moments with Daniel. He came home to California slowly, not to our old house. That house was long gone. Instead, Claire found a small cottage near Carpinteria, not far from the ocean. The first morning Daniel woke there, he stood in the kitchen for almost 10 minutes. He stared at the cabinets, at the coffee maker, at the sunlight coming through the window. "This feels familiar," he said. I smiled. "It should." He looked at me. "Did we have a kitchen like this?" "No." I laughed softly. "But I made you coffee every morning." He smiled. I remember the smell. That was how his memories returned. Not all at once. Little pieces. A song on the radio. The smell of sunscreen. The sound of waves. A blue sweater I had kept for 22 years. One afternoon, Claire brought him a photograph from her childhood. She was 6 years old. Her front teeth were missing. Daniel stared at the picture for a long time. Then tears rolled down his cheeks. I missed all of this. Claire sat beside him. Yes. She didn't try to make him feel better. She simply told him the truth. "You missed my first day of school." Daniel nodded. "My graduation." He closed his eyes. "My first job." "Yes." "And your wedding." Claire looked at him. "You were there." He opened his eyes. "What?" She smiled sadly. "You just didn't know who you were." Daniel cried again. So did I. There was no way to get those years back. No apology could return them. No money could buy them. But we could choose what happened next. Meanwhile, Gregory's case became bigger than any of us expected. Investigators discovered that he had been moving money through several companies for years. The original fraud had involved millions of dollars. And Daniel wasn't his only victim. There were former employees who had lost their careers, families who had lost homes, people who had been threatened into silence. Gregory had built an empire on fear. And now it was collapsing. Linda eventually gave investigators everything she had. She also moved out of Gregory's house. "I should have left years ago," she told me. I didn't judge her. I knew what fear could do to a person. But I also knew that courage sometimes begins with one small decision. Linda had finally made hers. One evening, Claire and I sat on the beach while the sun disappeared behind the horizon. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Mom? Do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if Dad had never disappeared?" I watched the waves. "Of course. What do you think?" I smiled. "I think we would have had different problems." She laughed. "Probably." Then she became quiet. "I used to think I wasn't enough." I looked at her. "Enough for what?" "Enough for him to stay." My heart broke. I took her hand. "Sweetheart, your father didn't leave you." She looked at me. "He was taken from us. And neither of us was responsible for that." She nodded slowly. For years, I had tried to protect Claire from the truth. Now I understood something. Sometimes the truth hurts. But living inside a lie hurts longer. That night, when we returned to the cottage, Daniel was waiting on the porch. He held something behind his back. "What is it?" I asked. He smiled. "A surprise." He handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph. Our wedding day. Daniel had kept it all these years. I touched the photograph with trembling fingers. "You had this." He nodded. "I don't remember everything." He took my hand. "But I remember loving you." I began to cry. Then he whispered, "I want to spend whatever years I have left proving that I never stopped." 6 months passed. Life became quieter. Not perfect, but real. Daniel still had difficult days. Sometimes he would wake up confused, convinced it was 2004. Sometimes he would look at Claire and remember her as a little girl instead of the woman she had become. and sometimes he would sit alone by the ocean for hours. I learned not to interrupt him. He had lost 22 years. He deserved time to grieve them. But there were beautiful moments too. Daniel learned how to use a smartphone. He complained about electric cars. He discovered that avocado toast was apparently a California tradition. And one Saturday morning, Claire taught him how to make pancakes. He stood at the kitchen counter, completely serious. "Are these supposed to be moons?" Claire laughed. "They're supposed to be pancakes." He looked at me. "Your mother made better ones." I gasped. "Excuse me?" He smiled. For the first time, it felt like the old Daniel was coming back. Not the man from 22 years ago. Someone new. Someone who had survived. Meanwhile, Gregory's trial moved forward. The evidence was overwhelming. His financial crimes were documented. The recordings were authentic. The hospital records connected him to Daniel. And several former employees came forward. Gregory eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges. He lost his companies. His properties were sold. The fortune he had spent decades building disappeared almost overnight. But when I heard the news, I felt nothing. No satisfaction. No happiness. Just relief. Because I had finally understood something. Justice wasn't about watching Gregory lose everything. Justice was getting my life back. One afternoon, Claire called me. "Mom, are you sitting down?" "Yes." "Why?" "I bought something." "What did you buy?" She laughed. "You're going to love it." An hour later, she arrived at the cottage. Behind her was a small moving truck. I stared at it. "What is that?" She smiled. "I bought a house." I hugged her. "Where?" She pointed toward the ocean. 5 minutes from here." Daniel came outside. He looked at the house, then at Claire. "You're staying?" She nodded. "I spent my whole life wondering what my family would have looked like." She looked at both of us. "Now I get to find out." That evening, the three of us sat on the beach. The sky turned pink over the Pacific. Claire leaned against Daniel's shoulder. I watched them quietly. 22 years ago, I had sat alone on another California beach with a pregnant belly and a broken heart. I had believed my life was over. I was wrong. Sometimes life doesn't give you back what you lost. Sometimes it gives you something different. Something you never thought you would have. Daniel took my hand. "Are you happy?" I looked at him, then at Claire, then at the ocean. "Yes." He smiled. "Good." I rested my head on his shoulder. For years, I had believed the worst thing Gregory stole from me was my husband. But I finally realized it wasn't. He had stolen my belief that I deserved a life filled with love. And that was the one thing I refused to let him keep. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I walked outside with a cup of coffee. The ocean was quiet. The sky was turning gold. And for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't waiting for someone to come home. They already had. A year after the wedding, Claire called me early one Sunday morning. "Mom, come outside." I opened the front door. She was standing in the driveway with Daniel. Behind them was a small wooden sign. I stared at it. "Reed Family House." I laughed. "What is this?" Claire smiled. "Dad helped me make it." Daniel shrugged. I thought it was time we had a name. We had spent the previous year slowly rebuilding our family. There were no grand gestures. No perfect movie moments. Just ordinary days. Sunday breakfasts. Walks along the beach. Birthday dinners. Arguments about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. Those ordinary moments became precious to me. Because for 22 years, I had believed ordinary family life was something other people were allowed to have. Now I finally understood how beautiful it was. Daniel also started working with a local organization that helped families affected by financial fraud. He couldn't get his lost years back. But he wanted to help people who were still trapped in the kind of fear he had once known. One afternoon, I asked him why. He looked at the ocean. Because somebody should have helped us. That answer stayed with me. Meanwhile, Claire and Ethan had made their own decision. They postponed their honeymoon after the wedding. Months later, they finally took the trip they had originally planned. Not to some expensive resort. They drove up the California coast. Big Sur. Monterey. Little towns where they stopped for coffee and watched the sunset. When they returned, Claire brought me a small seashell. For your collection. I smiled. You remembered. She laughed. Mom, you've been collecting shells since I was 6. I held it in my palm. It was such a tiny thing, but it reminded me of something important. My life had never actually been empty. I had simply been too busy surviving to notice how much love was already there. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch. The sun was disappearing behind the hills. He looked at me. Do you regret marrying me? I smiled. Not even for a second. Even after everything? Especially after everything. He reached for my hand. I wish I could give you those 22 years back. I looked at him. You can't. He lowered his eyes. But you can give me tomorrow. He smiled. I can do that. I leaned against his shoulder. For so long, I had thought my story was about a woman whose husband disappeared. Then I thought it was about a mother who raised her daughter alone. Then I thought it was about a powerful man finally getting what he deserved. But it wasn't any of those things. It was about a woman who had spent 22 years believing she had been abandoned, and finally discovering that she had never been forgotten. The truth had taken decades to arrive. But when it finally came, it didn't knock quietly. It walked into a wedding ballroom with police officers, old documents, and a photograph. It shattered a powerful man's reputation. It exposed a lifetime of lies. And it gave a daughter back the father she thought she had lost forever. I still think about that wedding sometimes. About the microphone in my hand. The 400 people watching me. Gregory's cruel smile. And the moment he realized that the woman he thought he had silenced for 22 years was finally standing in front of him without fear. If I could go back and speak to the younger version of myself, the frightened woman sitting alone at that kitchen table, I would tell her one thing. Your life isn't over. Sometimes the chapter that breaks your heart is simply the chapter that makes room for the truth. And sometimes, after 22 years of waiting, the people you love really do find their way home. 3 years have passed since that wedding. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to find myself back in that ballroom. The crystal lights, the flowers, the microphone trembling in my hand. Gregory Whitmore standing in front of 400 people, convinced he could humiliate me one last time. But then I hear the ocean outside my window. And I remember. That night wasn't the end of my life. It was the night I got it back. Daniel and I never tried to pretend the missing years didn't happen. We talked about them. We cried about them. Sometimes we even laughed about how strange our new life was. He had to learn how to be a husband again. I had to learn how to let someone take care of me. For 22 years, I had been the strong one. The provider. The mother. The woman who never asked anyone for anything. Now, when Daniel brought me coffee in the morning, I had to remind myself that I didn't have to say, I'm fine, I'll do it myself. I could simply say, thank you. And somehow, that small sentence felt like freedom. Claire and Ethan eventually bought a little house near the coast. Their wedding had been painful, but their marriage survived it. Maybe because they chose to build their life differently from the generation before them. They didn't care about expensive cars or enormous houses. They cared about Sunday dinners, family, honesty, and being there when things became difficult. One evening, Claire asked me something I will never forget. Mom, if you could change one thing about the past, what would it be? I thought about it. I thought about Daniel, about the years we lost, about Gregory, about all the fear. Then I shook my head. Nothing. She looked surprised. Nothing. I smiled. If I changed the past, I might change the road that brought us here. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. And you're happy? I looked around the kitchen. Daniel was making coffee. Claire was sitting across from me. The California evening sun was shining through the windows. Yes, I said. I am. Later that night, Daniel and I walked down to the beach. The tide was coming in. He stopped and looked at me. You know something? What? I used to think Gregory stole my life. I waited. He didn't. Daniel took my hand. He stole 22 years. He looked toward the horizon. But he didn't get the rest. I smiled. No, he didn't. We stood there in silence. The waves moved toward our feet and disappeared again. I thought about the woman I had been 22 years earlier. She had been terrified. She thought she had lost everything. But she had kept going. She had raised her daughter. She had worked. She had loved. She had survived. And eventually, she had found the truth. Maybe that's what I learned from everything that happened. You don't always get justice when you want it. You don't always get answers when you need them. And sometimes, the people who hurt you will spend years believing they got away with it. But truth has a strange way of waiting. It waits in old photographs, in forgotten letters, in hospital records, in people who finally find the courage to speak. And sometimes, it waits 22 years, until the exact moment you are strong enough to hear it. I looked at Daniel. He smiled. I looked at the lights of our little California town behind us. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what had been taken from me. I was thinking about everything I still had. My daughter, my husband, my family, my life, and the quiet certainty that no one would ever make me feel small again. Because once you've spent 22 years being silenced, you never forget the sound of your own voice. And when you finally find it again, you don't give it away.